Well, I wanted to welcome everyone to this installment of our book talk series on reimagining the Latinx experience. And we're very fortunate today to have with us Michael Rodriguez Muñiz, who's going to be talking about his book on figures of the future, Latino civil rights and the politics of demographic change. Before I introduce Professor Rodriguez Muñiz, I wanted to just say a few words of acknowledgement to people who have made this series possible. And then I also want to just give you a few ideas about how to participate with question and answers. So first of all, I wanted to thank Aaron Hebert and Robert Kadri of the UC Irvine Law Center's program for their work in making sure that we got the word out and that we have a smooth Zoom session here virtually. I also wanted to thank Dean Bryant Garth here at UC Irvine School of Law for his support, as well as Ajay Mehrotra at the American Bar Foundation for ongoing support of this program. And finally, I want to acknowledge my research assistant, Elizabeth Schatz Cordero, who has worked very closely with me in making certain that all of our authors are well supported and that the series reaches the broadest possible audience. Now, before we introduce our main event, Professor Rodriguez Muñiz, I wanted to mention that at the end of his talk, you can send your questions through the question and answer function. Elizabeth Schatz Cordero, my assistant, will be keeping track of your questions and posing them to Professor Rodriguez Muñiz, and we really do welcome your questions. They always greatly enrich our discussion. And now to what you've all been waiting for, our presentation today. And let me just briefly tell you that Professor Rodriguez Muñiz is at Northwestern University, where he is an assistant professor of sociology and Latino studies, and he's also affiliated with the Science and Human Culture program. His work focuses on the intersections of race, politics, and knowledge, with an emphasis on Latinx communities and movements. Now, his book today is based on his award-winning PhD dissertation, which he did at Brown University. And he was also a provost postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago. He has published in a variety of journals, including the American Journal of Sociology, the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, and the American Behavioral Scientist, among others. I also am very excited to learn that he's already busy at work on 2 new book projects, one of which is going to be grappling with the relationship between racialization, statecraft, and political trust. And he has a grant from the Russell Sage Foundation to support that work. And the other is another very important and interesting project on the afterlives of political repression against Chicago's anti-colonial Puerto Rican movements. So as you can see, we've got a wonderfully creative mind here at work, and we're very fortunate to benefit from his insights in this book. And we're certainly looking forward to featuring some of his additional work, which we look forward to reading in the future. So now please take it away, Professor Rodriguez Muñiz.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Moran, for the very kind introduction and for the invitation to share my work as part of the Reimagining the Latinx Experience book series at UC Irvine Law School. I want to thank Elizabeth Schatz Cordero and the rest of the team for logistical support and all of the effort it takes to organize an event like this. And I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. So I'll jump right in so we could get to that. As you know, the United States public sphere has been flooded with data and discourse about ethno-racial demographic change for much of the past several decades. It's only the latest episode in a much longer history. The present torrent centers on the purported growth of non-white populations and the decline of the white population, a development popularly described as the browning of America. This deluge of demographic numbers and narratives has made it difficult, perhaps impossible, for many of us to remain untouched by or unconcerned with ethno-racial population trends. Indeed, there's widespread consensus that the United States will look and feel dramatically different in the decades to come. At the same time, and not at all coincidentally, there's also widespread disagreement and division about what this all means and how this projected future should be met. Now, there's much that can be said about this demographic discourse, but what concerns me most and what motivates my book is how demographic discourse tends to take its own object for granted and how it characteristically disassociates itself from the political and cultural struggles of which it is undoubtedly part. As such, interrogating competing accounts of the country's demographic future demands, I believe, that we first confront what I call demographic naturalism. Demographic naturalism is a prevalent attitude towards demography, which rests on several assumptions. Among these are the idea that populations are conceived as real, natural, and actually existing entities, that population trends are akin to natural forces capable of impacting societies in a direct and unmediated fashion, the idea that demographic knowledge as a product of science more or less reflects or approximates demographic realities. These are perhaps reasonable assumptions to hold, but I think this overall attitude has some problems. For starters, demographic naturalism reifies populations, confusing what are statistical abstractions for actual groups. Statistical stereotypes and racial essentialisms flourish here, with populations often being ascribed certain proclivities, interests, and orientations. In addition, demographic naturalism prevents us from recognizing that populations are built rather than born. We lose sight of the labor, administrative infrastructure, social imaginaries, and statistical techniques and conventions through which we construct populations. Lastly, and most important for my talk, demographic naturalism makes it difficult to recognize that much of the apparent power of demography depends on the ways that demographic populations and trends are publicly and politically perceived. And furthermore, that these perceptions are not straightforward responses to said trends. Seeking to break with demographic naturalism, my book takes up the following broad question. How have we come to think and feel about ethno-racial demographics in the ways that we do? My book offers an answer to this question. It's certainly not the only answer, but I believe and hope to convince that it's an important and influential one. I argue that our perceptions and sentiments about demography cannot be fully accounted for or understood in isolation from what I label population politics. I'll elaborate on the concept shortly, but in brief, population politics refers to efforts and struggles to influence or impose certain understandings of demography, populations, and trends. I hold that our demographic imaginaries are products of cultivation, rooted in long histories and contemporary manifestations of racialized and gendered population politics. Now, this doesn't mean that efforts to shape demographic imaginaries always succeed, only that population politics often furnishes the conceptual categories, temporal registers, and rhetorical frames through which we think about demography. To date, what we know about population politics comes primarily from analyses of state actors and white supremacist leaders and movements. Without question, such analyses are important and increasingly so, but these are not the only agents of population politics. Political actors from minoritized groups have also wielded demographic numbers and narratives to shape and influence how demographic populations and futures are understood and felt. It's important to also take stock of how these projects and movements have envisioned and pursued ethno-racial futures. Without doing so, I think we compromise our ability to fully understand our political present. In my book, Figures of the Future, I direct attention to national Latino civil rights organizations and leaders, a network of political actors that scholars have, with few exceptions, ignored. Organizations like Unidos US and Voto Latino are active players and protagonists in contemporary struggles over the meaning of ethno-racial demographic change. Looking closely at their efforts, thus offers insights into this broader field of population politics, as well as the specific temporal tactics through which figures of the future are made and mobilized. And what remains, I'll be focusing first and elaborating a little bit more on what I mean by population politics as the concept grounds the book. And then I'll take a few minutes to talk a bit more about Latino civil rights advocacy, as well as the kind of data collection that I did. I'm happy to talk more about that. I'll just make a note about that. And then I'll turn to a particular sort of practice of population politics, which is forecasting, and then end with some implications and contributions. So rather than giving a kind of overarching view of the book, I'm going to be focusing today on a particular, for the most part, on a particular chapter. So the study of population politics directs our attention to the cultural politics that and knowledge that undergirds and shapes what people come to perceive as relevant demographic categories and what they come to feel are significant demographic changes. Drawing on past scholarship, I think we can distinguish between two phases of population politics. The first of these phases pertains to efforts to influence the content and production of demographic knowledge. There's countless examples of political and social actors lobbying for specific categories. An especially relevant example is the advocacy that led to the creation of the category Hispanic in the 1970s. The second phase takes place after this knowledge is produced. So once you have data, such as now we have data from the 2020 census, population politics takes on the task of supplying answers to questions such as the following. What does it mean that a given population is growing or decreasing? How should we prepare for the future apparently disclosed in the data? Who will benefit from demographic change and who will suffer? We know less about this phase of population politics, especially with respect to the specific practices through which population trends are made and marshaled as tools of rhetoric. In what follows, I'll be focusing exclusively on this second phase of population politics. With this conceptualization and focus in mind, let me turn to the empirical case. My book focuses largely on an understudied political network. National Latino civil rights organizations are part of the broader landscape of contemporary Latino, Latina, and Latinx politics. One aspect that distinguishes national advocates from most of the other elements in this landscape is their explicit desire, untenable as it may be, to advocate for the Latino community as a whole. They preeminently focus on the national political scene, where they regularly interface with state agencies, elected officials, the courts, think tanks, academics, media, philanthropy, corporations, social movements, and of course, other advocacy organizations. With few exceptions, the vast majority of national Latino civil rights organizations were born during or after the period that sociologist John Screntny has dubbed the Minority Rights Revolution, and as such are part of the explosion of advocacy organizations that occurred since the 1960s, or the civil rights period. In my research, I focused primarily on 5 organizations, though others appear in the book. These include the National Council of La Raza, which today is known as Unidos US. Unidos US and NCLR is probably the most well-known and best financed of these organizations. The League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, the oldest and largest Latino civil rights group. The National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials Education Fund, NALEO, which focuses on Latinos in elected office. And Voto Latino, an organization founded a decade and a half ago to organize Latino millennials. In 1992, many of these organizations founded the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. You can see the Hispanic NHLA's latest public policy agenda report on the right of the slide. And the NHLA has grown over the past several years to become an important coalition. These organizations are fully professionalized and led mostly by full-time advocates, though they rely to some extent on volunteers. Their work rests on government, philanthropic, and corporate funds. They are, as a result, comparatively better funded than their grassroots counterparts, although most have comparatively smaller budgets than many business and professional advocacy groups. With the exception of LULAC and NALEO, most are non-membership advocacy groups. As I mentioned, these organizations claim to speak on behalf of the Latino community and advocate for policies that will improve the welfare and status of this population. Like their predecessors during the sort of heat of the civil rights era, contemporary Latino civil rights organizations and leaders actively engage in population politics. Demographic numbers and narratives are ever present in their public-facing statements and reports. Indeed, facts and figures about the present and projected size of the Latino population saturate all major aspects of their efforts, including public relations, voter operations, and legislative campaigns, In some respects, a chapter is dedicated in the book to each of those areas. In this, they've not passively consumed narratives about the Latino population and its future impact. Rather, as I'll show, they've developed and deployed their own accounts to rally supporters, entice funders, challenge opponents, and insert themselves onto the national stage. Convinced that Latino political power is inseparable from Latino demographics, advocacy organizations have sought and struggled to render this, quote, second largest ethno-racial population as both politically potent and socially palatable in the public imagination. My study of these organizations has revealed sort of three kinds of temporal tactics of population politics. These are forecasting, foreshadowing, and forewarning. I'm happy to talk about all of them, but today I'm just going to focus on the first, forecasting. Before diving in, I would just want to say a word about the research upon which the analysis I'm going to present is based. So I began conducting field work in 2012, which led me to various places, including Orlando, Florida, Washington, D.C., where I spent probably the most amount of time, as well as to events and activities that these organizations were organizing or participating in across the country, from lobbying initiatives to voter registration drives, to power summits, to national conferences and press conferences that were held from New York to Orlando to Washington, D.C. to Chicago. In addition, I conducted 70 interviews with the heads of these organizations, canvassers, staff, data analysts, elected officials, as well as other actors that these organizations interact with and interface with. Along with participant observation, ethnographic work, and qualitative interviews, I collected as many primary materials as I could, both print and multimedia, from newspaper articles to PSAs developed by these organizations, policy reports, press releases, public statements that they made, as well as flyers and business cards that these organizations produced as well. So as my discussion of forecasting will illustrate, I draw on and integrate these different sources of data in my analysis. So now I want to jump into this tactic of forecasting, which is the first temporal tactic of population politics that I discuss in the book. And I argue it sets the stage for the other types. Let me begin with an ethnographic scene from the book. As the lights dim, silence quickly comes over the Mandalay Bay Convention Hall. I sit among hundreds of attendees at the National Council of La Raza's 2012 annual conference. Insulated from the blistering Las Vegas sun, we have directed our attention at a massive projection screen. Univision's video, The New American Reality, has begun to play. Its opening seconds fill the hall with a warm blue light and a soothing flamenco guitar. The puzzle piece, symbolizing the Latino population, sits beneath two words that unfold into a bold sentence. Without me, America would not grow as fast or be as strong. The assertion is as definitive as it is familiar. Even so, the video, judging from the room's silence, is engrossing. Developed as a marketing tool, the video is seductive from its smooth animation and vivid colors to the simplicity of its narrative. It serves up a stylized and carefully curated story about the Latino population anchored by demography. One slide states, "Without me, playgrounds in Texas, New York, Florida, California would be half empty." Another states, "I will account for 95% of the teen population growth through 2020. The statistics are accompanied by line graphs and images, but the video is far more than an animated infographic. One slide poses the existential question, who am I? Answers follow in a series of claims. I am not the melting pot. I am the new American reality. I live at the intersection of my two cultures. I am reggaeton and rock and roll. I am tamales and cheeseburgers." The list goes on, but the message is clear. The Latino population is bilingual and bicultural at once, and wholly Latino and wholly American. There is no hint of internal tension or external threat. In its final seconds, three simple words appear. I am here. All those seated at my table and across from the convention hall burst into applause. On cue, journalist Maria Elena Salinas, the luncheon's master of ceremonies returns to the podium. Facing out to a hungry audience, the co-anchor of Noticiero Univision, the country's most watched Spanish language news show, states, "I love that video. I've seen it a couple of times, and each and every time it makes me feel so proud to be Mexican American in this country." As I begin to contemplate from my seat how an explicitly pan-ethnic message nonetheless incited ethnic pride, Salinas invites to the podium Univision's senior vice president to speak. Evelise Estrada asks, "Are we or are we not the new American reality?" Without allowing a second of reflection, Estrada leans into the microphone, lightly clutches it in her right hand, and declares, "Yes, we are." Applause once again fills the room. 2 years after the 2010 census, NCLR's conference was awash in figures and tales about the Latino population. Time and time again, invited speakers and corporate sponsors described this population as large, growing, youthful, and primed for economic advancement and educational success. The storylines of NCLR's leaders were similar, but more focused on politics and power. In that year's presidential address, Janet Murguia claimed that young Latinos were America's future and that inevitable demographic shifts were remaking electoral landscapes. She says, "We are a community of 50 million people, and it's long past time we start acting like it," she told her affiliates. All these expressions were acts of a particular tactic of population politics, what I call forecasting. Forecasting not only projects a future, it also communicates how this future should be interpreted. What I have in mind is not a mere numerical projection, although as we'll see, numbers play an important role. Forecasting requires considerable cultural political work. In what follows, I'll briefly highlight 3 interlinked practices by which Latino advocates have forecasted demographic futures in the wake of the 2010 census. These practices are qualification, curation, and narration. While intertwined in practice, I'll separate them out for illustrative purposes. So let's start with the aspect of qualification. Qualification refers to the ways that ideas and information are charged with meaning. This involves, among other things, the valences and values that numbers are given. In other words, how a quantity is represented as a quality. Immediately after the Census Bureau released the results of the 2010 census, national Latino groups began to qualify this data. The Los Angeles-based NALEO issued a series of press releases that variously characterized Latino demographic growth as key, pivotal, exceptional, and significant. One headline read, "Latinos play major role in nation's growth." Such phrasing doesn't just inform us about data, they communicate how we should interpret them, in this case, as important and monumental. Above all, the main figure that Latino advocates qualified was the figure of 50.5 million, the number of self-identified Latino persons counted in the 2010 census. This figure came to anchor their population politics. Through its public invocation, 50.5 million became what sociologist Martín de Santos called a factotum, or a statistic rendered an emotively charged collective representation. Ubiquitous in speeches and presentations, reports, and op-eds, this figure was used to project demographic strength. Its meaning was not inherent to the number, it was ascribed to it. In an op-ed in March 2011, Arturo Vargas asserted, "Latinos are now more than 50 million strong and represent 1 in 6 Americans. We accounted for more than half of the US population increase since 2020. We have exceeded estimates in some states. We are the fastest growing segment of the nation's population and already the 2nd largest." Similarly, an abstract from a LULAC panel on Latino consumers stated, "Come learn more about how your company can better target this ever-growing consumer base with more than 52 million strong and representing the majority population growth over the next 5 years." In each of these examples, the word strong qualified the figure and gave it meaning. It instructed readers and audiences to understand the figure as a sign of strength. Amplifying this effect, the figure was made into a slogan. I first encountered it in April 2012 as I made my way onto Voto Latino's first Power Summit. Walking past registration tables at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, I and 100 or so other participants were greeted by tall and colorful banners proclaiming, quote, "We are 50 million strong." The slogan was very much alive across the summit's 2 days of workshops, speeches, from the likes of actress and Voto Latino co-founder Rosario Dawson and labor and civil rights legend Dolores Huerta. Through such practices, this figure became, at least in certain moments, not just a mere factoid. It became a kind of emblem, a signifier of Latino identity and power. In other words, the number was no longer just a quantity, it was also a quality. Forecasting doesn't just involve qualification, it also entails practices of what I call curation. By curation, I mean decisions about emphasis and selection. These decisions include those about whether to lump or split statistical populations or to foreground or background particular figures. Think about the decision to combine data on several ethno-racial populations to produce a demographic profile of so-called minorities. In other words, curation is about the choices made about how and what data to present. Now, we've already seen curation at play in the decision to focus on the 50 million figure as opposed to other figures about the Latino population. Here, I'd like to discuss a different example, the choice to present pan-ethnic rather than subgroup data. Take, for example, these two reports. No need to try to read them. These two reports were produced by NCLR Unidos US shortly after the 2010 census data became available. They include maps and graphs as well as other information about the Latino population. What's noteworthy is that at no point is any information given about subgroups, Mexicans, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, etc. It's not that these organizations never disaggregate data, they do. For instance, the report to the right focuses only on Latino children. All of this contrasts strongly with previous years and decades when pan-ethnic and ethnic data were routinely co-presented. With few exceptions, this was no longer the case as far as I found in my research. Along with this emphasis on pan-ethnicity and the preference for the label Latino, national Latino advocates today favor a particular characterization of ethno-racial demographic futures. In speeches and publications, change is principally and often nearly exclusively framed as a singularly Latino affair. In one op-ed, an advocate claimed, quote, "New census data confirms that we are what we've been seeing for some time now. America has a new face, and that new face is Latino." The Latino organization's focus on Latino demographics is expected, but even so, this focus does reveal certain choices, particularly as their political and cultural context offers numerous ways to talk about and to present demographic data. Some groups have aggregated data to frame population trends as the emergence of a, quote, new majority, composed of the country's minority populations. Others have used phrases like majority minority. For reasons that will become clearer shortly, national Latino leaders have opted not to use terms or any language that connotes that the country's browning. Talk of diversity did appear, but typically positioned and presented data with Latinos as the primary drivers of diversification. Ultimately, through its curational decisions on what data to present and what categories to use, Latino advocates made clear that the country's future is unmistakably Latino. This point was further deepened in combination with the last component of forecasting, narration. The forecast of National Latino Civil Rights Group was based not only, again, on qualifications and curations, but on a particular narrative. While numbers and narratives are often treated as distinct, as the sociologist Wendy Espeland writes, quote, "The binary division of numbers and stories does not capture their complex interplay, and the way numbers sometimes evoke narrative and vice versa. Statistical figures and even projections need to be narrated and plotted to become meaningful." Contending with and contesting with other forecasts, advocates put forth a narrative, their own narrative of the future. This narrative was affirmative, perhaps even utopian. Take, for example, one of the NCLR reports shown on a previous slide. Its narrative is expressed in its headline, quote, "Nationwide growth in the Latino population is a boon for the country." The fact sheet open. Latinos have been part of the American fabric since the birth of the country and will play an essential role in the progress of the nation. Newly released 2010 census national data show that in the past decade, the Latino population has grown remarkably in most regions of the country and is characterized in a large part by its youthfulness. Given the aging of our overall population and the growing number of baby boomers approaching retirement, the increase in the Latino population is good news. Although only a few pages long, the document, as this quote illustrates, was not short on narrative. It told readers that the Latino population growth was positive and beneficial. And underlying this narrative, we can see a few points of interest. While pointing to the future, it looked to the past, claiming Latinos as part of the American fabric. This contested the idea that this population was new or foreign. In addition, the narrative was spatial as well as temporal. Latino growth was geographically far-reaching, a point that these organizations have been making since the 1970s. This narrative also expresses what we might understand as a kind of demographic linked fate. This linked fate is not what the political scientist Michael Dawson had in mind with the concept of linked fate. The kind espoused by Latino advocates was not rooted in shared social, political, or racialized conditions. Rather, it was an effect of the future determining power of demographics. A key component of this demographic narrative is an idealized, often essentialist representation of the Latino population. The fact sheet, for example, characterized the population as committed to hard work, civic engagement, patriotism, and hope. It answered without asking, what could there be to fear? The NCLR fact sheet was not alone in its forecast and characterization of the Latino population. In August 2011, Voto Latino's Kumar gave a TEDx talk in Washington Heights, New York. In it, she proclaimed that Latinos, quote, exemplify the true America. Standing to a left of a large screen, she accompanied her remarks by a series of graphs and maps, tools to help the audience visualize her image of the Latino population. During her remarks, she says, we have a lot of people right now, a lot of naysayers that America's on decline. I actually say the Latino community is the silver lining of where we're going in the future because we're young, we're workaholics, and we believe in America when everybody else doesn't. Despite our economic difficulties and educational needs, we profoundly believe in what America is and the possibility that immigrant belief. It is because of that that America's best days actually lie ahead. Kumar's statement depicts Latinos as essentially positive and quintessentially American. It's an aspirational vision. These accounts and narratives of Latinos are examples of what the anthropologist Arlene Davila has referred to as Latino spin. Davila argues that the emphasis on seemingly positive stereotypes of Latinos emerge within a neoliberal horizon that demands minoritized ethno-racial groups, quote, prove their value as political constituencies and consumers if they're to be welcomed to the national political table. These characterizations we can see rest on essentialisms. For example, the idea that this population is almost by nature hardworking. This omits and obscures the conditions of precarity and exploitation that undergird much Latinx labor. Such representations, combined with particular forecasting practices of qualification, curation, and narration, of course, do not emerge within a political or discursive vacuum. We have to understand them as a response to other forecasts in circulation. This effort and the content of their forecast requires attending, therefore, to the wider field of population politics. Efforts to build hopeful anticipation about the future cannot be understood apart from fears about white backlash. As the NHLA member, Angelo Falcon told the press in January 2011, with a more conservative Congress in place, this next census announcement will reignite the next generation of immigration debate and all the anti-Latino rhetoric it brings with it. Ironically, perhaps, the census, a tool so vital for Latinos' political work and agenda, was expected to intensify anti-Latino rhetoric. Unwilling to wait for backlash, organizations prepared and promulgated their forecasts to manage demographobia, that is, anxiety and fear about demographic trends. Months before the census data was released, Ingrid Ramos, NCLR's Associate Director of Research, spearheaded preparations. Using message maps, she assembled leading staff members to create positive narratives about, quote, who we are as Latinos. She feared that if, in the absence of a coordinated public relations strategy, people would read the new census data and conclude, oh my God, there's such a huge Latino population, it's terrible, the country is going to fall apart. She believed that NCLR could minimize fears that people have around changing race and ethnicity issues, and viewed the construction of a counter-narrative as a defensive move against long-standing stereotypes and representations. NCLR advocates were under no illusions about the limits of the strategy they had adopted. Some people would remain unconvinced, those Ramos said that had animosity towards Latinos rather than anxiety. Anxiety, she thought, was, quote, an emotion that people want to resolve. Her colleague, Clarissa Martinez, was blunter. Nobody here is trying to win over nativists, all right? Nativists and those who peddle anti-immigrant and anti-Latino pro-white rhetoric, she argued, were, quote, not the majority of Americans, but they did have an outsized influence on public discourse on immigration and population change. Anti-Latino advocates and leaders needed to be challenged, but also those merely anxious also needed to be engaged. Even as they were well aware of the likes of John Tanton and Ann Coulter, as well as many other lesser-known nativists and white nationalists, advocates almost universally depicted demographic fear as a natural response to population change. As such, these opponents were depicted as actors tapping into our, quote, worst instincts, rather than as fomenters of anxiety. As Martina said, it's okay to feel anxious about change. We all do. It's a human thing. NCLR CEO Janet Murguia expressed this assumption and position in a 2011 Wall Street Journal op-ed titled Hispanic Values Are American Values. Pointing to the past moments of demographic change, Murguia wrote, like others who brought demographic change to America, our presence has stirred anxiety among some of our fellow Americans. She went on to say, as the number of Latinos grow, our fellow Americans need to overcome the natural human anxiety that accompanies change and look for a common ground. Through such assertions, Latino advocates and leaders naturalized demographobia, treating it as if it was an automatic, perhaps even inevitable response to population trends, rather than as an outcome of political cultivation via population politics. So what do we gain from this deep dive into the cultural practices behind the forecasting of national Latino civil rights organizations? So by way of a conclusion, I'd like to sort of suggest a few implications and contributions from the foregoing analysis, and I'm just going to focus on three, though I know we're running out of time, so I may only just focus on two. So my examination of national Latino civil rights organizations reveals a deep investment in population politics. Although I focused today on a slice of recent history, this investment has long historical roots, which I discuss in the book. And it's still very much part of the repertoire today. Upon the release of 2020 census data from this past August, Unidos US declared once again, quote, growth of US Hispanic population shows the future is Latino. Through such statements and forecasts, among other temporal tactics, advocates have contributed, among other things, to the futurization of Latinx peoples. Along with other agents of population politics, they have fueled the idea that the Latino population matters most to the future. This temporal register renders Latinx presence as always lacking in relation to some bright forecasted future. In doing so, it traps the avowed impact, significance, and influence of this population in the future, which, as the anthropologist Jonathan Rosa has written, quote, positions the Latino population in relation to a distinctive social tense of always not yet, or perhaps never quite yet. As I've discussed, talk about Latinos in the future tense has been linked to expressions of demographic respectability. That is the presentation of Latino population in ways that are seen as white appeasing and marketable. On a personal level, most of the advocates I spoke to carried the conviction that demographic trends represent a trajectory of progress. To be sure, they've been plenty frustrated at the rate of improvement and empowerment, and certainly troubled by the post-Obama politics of white resentment. Although tested, confidence remains that a bright future is on the horizon. Far from unique, this presumption of linear progress has long dominated intellectual and political discourses about race and racism in the United States. From this conception of social change, the question becomes speed, whether presumed or projected progress comes slow or fast. For these actors, population politics, including forecasting, offers a means to accelerate the political power they believe demography will secure for them in the future. There's strong historical and current political reasons to doubt such assumptions. In addition, I believe the analysis invites us to reorient our approach and conception to statistics, To date, research on population statistics has either tended to take such knowledge for granted, ignoring their political sources and stakes, or sought or perhaps used to correct or improve such knowledge. Building on the sociology of quantification, I focus not on the truth of such data, but how this data is made meaningful. Books, for instance, that teach people how to discern between good and bad data can inadvertently encourage people to reify statistics rather than to confront the more politically and ethically complicated reality that all numbers are to some extent cooked. By cooked, I don't mean that statistics, demographic or otherwise, are necessarily or reducibly partisan, corrupt, or ideological. Rather, it's to recognize, as scholars have known for some time, that, quote, political judgments are implicit in the choice of what to measure, how to measure it, how often to measure it, and how to present and interpret the results. As such, I join scholars that have called for greater attention to the utility and performativity of numbers rather than simply to their accuracy. In this, we can't limit our consideration limit our consideration to the politics of production. Here, I focus not on how census data, for instance, is produced, but how this data circulates and is taken up and mobilized. So by paying attention to both processes of population politics during production and its circulation, I think that this approach helps us denaturalize our demographic assumptions and imaginaries, revealing them to be historical and contextual outcomes of particular struggles over the meaning of demography. And this leads me to my last point. Finally, I've hoped to convince that we need more analyses of population politics. As I opened with, we exist in a political and discursive context saturated with demographic discourse and competing ideas about ethno-racial futures. This, of course, is not an abstract issue. Demographic imaginaries fueled by population politics are profoundly influencing contemporary politics, identity, and policymaking. And beyond this, we know that population politics can be a matter of life and death. We need only recall that 2 years ago, a white supremacist killed 23 in El Paso, claiming to be fighting a, quote, Hispanic invasion. This horrific act is only one in a long history of population politics-fueled racist violence. Our attention, however, must not only be on the actors and movements through which white demographobia is being stoked. We must also create space to understand how those from minoritized groups have also engaged in population politics as a means to address longstanding exclusions and build political power, however constrained. As we can see through the example of Latino civil rights agencies, population politics need not be conducted in the service of population control or demographic engineering. Even now, as data from the 2020 census circulates, we're much more inclined to dissect demographic data than to track and unsettle the demographic rhetoric vying for dominance. The latest census, for instance, has revived ongoing scholarly debate about the future of the ethno-racial order. I won't restate the contours of this debate, but will note that whatever its value, this debate has largely sidestepped contemporary population politics. Somewhat ironically, leading voices in this debate claim to simply follow the data and deny their involvement and investment in the struggles over how we should understand and feel about these demographic trends. Through my work, I hope I can in some way contribute to shifting the conversation away from demographic naturalism and its inevitabilities and towards a greater attention to the ways that projective racial futures are being brought to bear on the present and the future being made. With that said, thank you so much for your time and indulgence, and I look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Rodriguez Muniz, for that really wonderful talk about your very important book. And I would just remind people that if you registered, you can get a discount if your appetite was whetted and you'd like to read about all the other wonderful information in the book. Please also feel free to submit your questions in our chat, our Q&A function. We really want to hear from you with your questions so that we can deepen this conversation. So while you're getting your questions submitted through the Q&A function, I just wanted to start off and, we'll give people a little time, because one of the parts of the book that was so interesting to me is that at the very tail end of it, Donald Trump is elected president. And all of these organizations that you have been studying and who've been suggesting that we have this kind of demographic destiny or future have to come to grips with what's happened, which might seem to be inconsistent with the forecasting you've just described. And so you say a little bit about that in the book, and I thought might be interesting while we wait for our audience questions for you to describe that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. It prolonged the book process because I also had to I had to deal with, a moment where the projections, were severely tested, at least for a moment. And what I discuss in that chapter is, to some extent, the kind of like internal debates that arise when faced with a Trump presidency, which these organizations, among many sort of observers, right, and political scientists and other scholars, right, who saw the kind of Trump presidency and the kind of rhetoric that came with it as, a thing of the past, rather than a thing of our present and potentially of the future. So I discuss, the kind of internal debates that arose, with some actors sort of arguing that that the group should stay the course and continue to do what they've been doing, continue saying what they've been doing, where others were saying we need to change and modify their practices, often sort of looking to the past and drawing inspiration from more activists rather than kind of more mainstream advocacy practices. And then finally, another thing that arose is people, a set of actors beginning to problematize the demographic statistics themselves and whether they actually should be interpreted as signs of progress when rates of disparity across a number of social and political fields, they began to argue, has actually increased over the past few decades rather than decreasing. And so there should be no assumption about that further growth is automatically or necessarily going to lead to greater political power. So those are some of the sort of debates and discussions that emerge in response to this, what seemed for many a kind of unthinkable Trump presidency.
Well, that's terrific. We do have a question that was in the chat function, so however you want, but I did want to mention it is from one of our distinguished professors of racial and ethnic identity here at UC Irvine, Edward Thayes. Elizabeth, did you want to share that question? And please feel free, submit your questions to however you want to, but we just wanted to hear from you.
So the question is, did you find that civil rights leaders used race, particularly whiteness, among Latinos as a way to manage or alleviate nativism or demographobia, sorry?
So that's a great question. And thank you, Professor Thayes, for the ongoing support of the project and my work. So thank you for the question. In my work, I didn't find, their articulations are quite distinct, for instance, from what we know of early LULAC in the late 1920s, 30s, and 40s, leading into the 50s, which is Julie Dowling, sociologist, has argued they kind of leaned into whiteness, the kind of defensive whiteness, to defend, protect or defend or grow civil rights for the Mexican American community. That's certainly not the discourse that these organizations talk about. They are they talk about Latino, Latina pretty in an amplified sort of way, and so there wasn't sort of appeals to sort of racial whiteness in their statements. One could argue that the kinds of sort of rhetorical moves that they make around emphasizing citizenship or hardworking or conservative, that are coded, often historically have been coded as white, are some of the like rhetorical kind of ploys that they engage in, but they certainly don't stress that this population is racially white or becoming white, or as a result of their proximity, quote unquote, to whiteness, they should have certain benefits or receive certain rights. But with the kind of respectability politics, you can see certainly a a pretty strong overarching concern with what do whites think and how do we reassure whites. And that shapes, and I think in a really profound way, how they talk about demographics. So that's how I would respond to that great question.
Well, I actually wanted to also ask you a little bit about the fact that you said most of these organizations were not membership organizations.
Yeah.
So I did wonder, we're going to have a talk next semester about the evolution of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the ways in which the funding sources really shaped the agenda and constrained some of the advocacy that was undertaken. And I just wondered, you know, when you think about these non-membership organizations, who's the audience and who's influencing the message because of the need to get funding? And you said that they were not necessarily as well funded as some of the other organizations that are out there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you know, a couple things that come to mind. There's still a lot I think that needs to be done, and I'm glad for Marquez's, you know, upcoming book, because we actually, the inner workings of these organizations, we have a bit more sense of the history of these organizations, and I think he's going to provide, with respect to MALDEF, some of the role of philanthropy, specifically the Ford Foundation. You know, my analysis wasn't around sort of funding streams sort of explicitly, though I could see in like the sponsors of these of their conferences and events, you know, Walmart and you name it, certain banks and media corporations sort of being, you know, chief media sponsors. I'm not exactly sure to what extent these funders sort of at this stage monitor their rhetoric and discourse. Much of the rhetoric and discourse that these organizations sort of speak to already is kind of like several decades in the making, you know, like they've had this kind of like hopeful future more or less in play since the beginning of the late 1970s, early 80s, and have tweaked it and refined it and drawn on new sources of data to talk about it. But for respect to population politics, I don't, my sense is that these corporations or fund, you know, philanthropy are not sort of dictating the terms of those discussions, though these organizations are certainly turning to the demographic data and their narratives now to entice further contributions, donations, and the like. And one place where this doesn't sort of pan out very well has to do around electoral politics, which I mentioned at some points in the book, how these advocacy organizations over the last couple election cycles have actually received sort of less support from philanthropy and other entities to get out the vote for the Latinx population, with the presumption that because of Trump rhetoric and other things, the Latinx population would almost like vote automatically. Anybody who studies politics knows nothing happens automatically. It takes work and organizing. But yeah, those are some thoughts, but certainly the historical piece, I think perhaps more than now, at least on the level of the demographics. On their policy positions, you could probably argue that much of that influence is much stronger on what they choose to advocate on behalf and what sort of policy to get behind or to oppose. You may have some implicit or explicit gestures from some of these sources, but not necessarily the kind of like overlaying demographic narratives.
And then just because your talk fits so well with another talk that we had by Professor Richard Alba on the Great Demographic Illusion. One of the interesting things for me about your story is that people give these numbers a kind of scientific credibility at a time when we see other kinds of expertise being discredited, ignored, questioned, you know, fake news, fraud, you know, people don't trust experts. And yet here you see the level of credibility that's given to these numbers about demographic change. And I wondered why that is the case. Is it because it serves the interests of both sides of the ideological spectrum? It's a story of growth and possibility, and then also of threat and the need for retrenchment. And so the numbers are basically given their due because they serve a larger purpose, or is there some other reason?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I mean it's something that I don't tackle in the book, but I think is certainly part of the moment in which I was studying. Right, it's like the rise of the things you mentioned, of fake news, the kind of skepticism to scholarly expertise, that kind of thing, and you don't see that as you mentioned in relation to these demographic statistics. So I think you're absolutely correct that, and I would agree with you that. One of the things that kind of preserves that kind of trust in numbers around these demographics is that they're largely not contested by pretty much any of the players at this point, you know, major players, let's say. So on the right, you have a kind of like, this is what the future is going to look like. It's scary. And you might have among civil rights groups and advocacy, you know, a group saying, you know, the future looks really bright, but the data undergirding that and some of the faith in the projections isn't all that different. You know, so I think unlike other sources of knowledge, there hasn't been a kind of like, this is fake news. What is fake news, what gets described as either fake news or whatever is particular interpretations of the data, such that when somebody like Ann Coulter writes a book, Adios America, she's looking at some of those sort of more optimistic, positive narratives and saying, okay, that's completely fake. Look at this. And she'll marshal other forms of data and give her own account, her own forecast to undercut those, right? So despite for the most part, not disagreement over numbers, you can see that there's a pretty endless possibilities of struggle over what they mean, both across very far sort of ideological positions and even among seemingly close ideological kind of cousins, but have slightly different valences that they attribute to those demographic trends.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for that fascinating answer about the contest over how quantity becomes quality, but also for the talk and your wonderful book. Just a reminder, if you want to get it, you do have that discount that Princeton Press kindly offered. I also, in addition to thanking Professor Rodriguez Muñiz for what I just personally thought was just such an enjoyable talk, and the book is equally accessible and engaging. I wanted to mention an event that's coming up. We're going to be looking at the future of UCI as an HSI, and that's going to take place on Thursday, November 18th at 12 noon. We're going to have Assistant Vice Chancellor Sandra Campero talking about the UCI OC Alliance for a Latinx Thriving University, as well as Associate Director Joseph Morales of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships in the Office of Inclusive Excellence. And we're sorry to say that our next installment of the Book Talk series on December 2nd had to be canceled because of some family emergencies affecting Professor Conchas, but he's agreed to speak with us in the spring. So we look forward to seeing you at future events. We thank you for attending this event, and we wish you the best as we know the semester begins to draw to a close, but we'll hope you'll make time to come back and see our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.